So the talk I'm presenting on today draws on a number of elements of several projects that I've been working on. The main piece that I'll be working on as part of the paper uh, draws on a particular figure and memoir that I'm in the process of editing. Now, when I came up with the title, part of the title is for us to think about not only intellectually what we could call a Muslim left, and I will get into some of the kind of issues of categorization or even how we might even define what this term even means. But in my imagination of it, I am thinking of it very much as a itinerant sort of category that in many ways I'd like to refuse to define it. But let's start with obvious places, right? Malcolm X. And Malcolm X is actually, in teaching and reading Malcolm X, I have often been sort of struck by, in US history, when we talk about the Black Liberation Movement or we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, right? The way in which Black nationalism has sort of taken on Malcolm X as a central figure of that discussion, on the one hand, has made him into this secularized figure, right? So that we know him, and of course this occurs in various ways, and the way that we think about Malcolm X is often as a critic of white supremacy, right? And I think that's a very important thing. And for those of you who don't read the speeches like I do every once in a while, go back and read those speeches. Listen to the speeches. Listen to him give those speeches. And I wanted to show this image for us to think about two things straight out of in terms of reflection. One, of Malcolm X as a philosopher. If we take his writings and thinking as a philosopher and not just as a critic or even as a religious figure, what would it mean to take Malcolm X's thinking as a philosopher? And secondly, and this point I think is in certainly I owe a little bit of a debt to Edward Curtis and his recent writing, and he noticed it when he read my abstract, he mentioned it. His recent writing in the Journal of American History, this push that Edward is having us think about Islamic liberation theology. So the second in relationship to Malcolm as a philosopher is what if we think of him as a theologian, right? Now, theologian in the sense that not only are his positions when he's critiquing white supremacy or he's taking on anti-imperial stances, he's entering into the realm of political discourse. What would that provide for us in terms of thinking about his religious beliefs, but also his political beliefs, right? So there's that conundrum. Now when I say this, philosophy and theology, right? The one place that we all sort of go to, and can everyone read this pretty clearly? We go to the two sort of iterations of the sort of one of his more famous speeches, the Ballot or the Bullet, right? And so the top one here is a paragraph from, and I think that's also, in a way, it's something that if you just search on the internet, you're going to get that quote over and over again. I was just at the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville with Evelyn, and there was actually this quote was there, the top one, with a picture of Malcolm X. So it's interesting in terms of, right, thinking about precisely this narrative, right, this very first moment when he's in Cleveland. No, I'm not an American. I'm one of the 22 million black people who are the victims of Americanism. One of the 22 million black people we're the victims of democracy, nothing but disguised hypocrisy. So I'm not standing here speaking to you as an American or a patriot or a flag saluter or a flag waver. No, not I. I'm speaking as a victim of this American system. And I see America through the eyes of the victim. I don't see any American dream. I see an American nightmare. Now, part, again, of where I am thinking through this, and I would have us all think through this, is conceptually, what is the American nightmare, right? Is this the afterlife of slavery? Is this the afterlife of settler colonialism? Is this the afterlife of white supremacy, right? And so if we take the American nightmare seriously, right, what does it mean? What do we mean when we're talking about Muslim politics? What do we mean about American politics? And now just a quick interlude, because Muhammad, when he saw the title of my paper, he was like, well, do you mean a possible history of the Muslim American left? And I said, no. And the reason why I would have us pause on that point, right, and then I'll get to the second part, is for a number of reasons, but I don't want to outline too many of them there. But one is that I think that we should, when we use this term Muslim American, it should be defined in terms of actually existing usage of that term. Are people using that term, and what does it mean to them? So as an ethnographer and an anthropologist, I'm actually talking about ethnographically present. Right? People are saying, Muslim American, I'm a Muslim American. What does that mean? Secondly, as scholars, the term Muslim American is troubling for me. Troubling because precisely what Malcolm's saying in terms of the American nightmare, but also because it so clearly is defined in terms of American as the noun. Right? So if American is the noun and Muslim is the adjective, right? If that's the noun, that means a particular kind of system of thinking of a rights-based narrative that depends on the liberal state. So it's basically what I'm saying, it's a liberal argument, right? So as scholars, I think we should be a little skeptical of that, right? Secondly, now, and this is where it's interesting to me, how does Malcolm go one week to the next where he's using essentially in his speech, where he's got an outline. I mean, most of his speeches were very extemporaneous, but he had a sense of what he was going to say. He didn't say what he said at the top. He changed it to, I'm not a politician. I'm not even a student of politics. I'm not a Republican, nor a Democrat, nor an American. And got sense enough to know it. Okay, and the rest you can read. But that point there, right? In terms of, I'm not a politician. But is he not using politics? Is he not thinking about politics, right? So in a way, right, if you were a literalist, you'd be like, you know, Malcolm X doesn't want to be engaged in politics, right? And often in other speeches, other places, he talked about, particularly after he departed from the Nation of Islam, he was talking about the separation between religious life in the mosque and political life as a public life, right? He was making those sort of distinctions. However, again, I think there's a little bit more fuzziness here, right? And I would even say that part of what he's talking about here is that he's not a politician in the sense of electoral politics, a Republican or a Democrat, a liberal or a conservative, right? He wants to imagine the political realm far a bigger, far wider than what is given to him, right? Now the final Malcolm image, this is also some recent conversations that we had. But I think this stamp, right? It's an Iranian stamp that commemorated Malcolm X, the Universal Day of Struggle Against Race Discrimination. It again is a way to reflect on how to think about the way that Malcolm talked about the need to go from a civil rights narrative to a human rights narrative. So the human rights narrative was not only the containment of how we think about politics in terms of nation states, right? We often think about, okay, Republican, Democrat, that's the politics of where we are, the country we live in, the immediate local. But how are politics also global, right? And even in this act of solidarity through this commemorative stamp, right, that is part of what the human rights discourse is about. It's about a kind of globalization of this instance. So the whole Malcolm bit here is a way, it's a preamble to the larger project, right? And one last thing here is that one of the ways I was thinking about the Muslim left emerged out of, interestingly enough, some of the writings that I was seeing around Black Lives Matter and folks reflecting on what they were calling the Christian left, right? Does anybody have a clue who they were talking about? A famous figure of the Christian left in the civil rights struggle. Anybody raise their hand? Anybody know? Martin Luther King, exactly, right? So I was thinking to myself, okay, so we know Martin Luther King as a religious figure, but then Malcolm X, why don't we know him as a religious figure, right? We know him as a black nationalist, right? And so what would it mean to call him a part of the Muslim left, even though, again, like I said, he in various places has said he's not right or left. But what if you claim him as that? What would it mean to claim others as that, right? What would that genealogy do for us? Okay, that's my preamble. I don't know how much time I wasted on that. So what the project here, in terms of thinking pretty broadly in terms of how we can think back to not only U.S. history, but global history, right? Because for me, the global left is a kind of global object, right? In many ways, I think that social movement struggles, whether we look at what's going on today in various places, whether it be the United States or other countries, that in many ways the success or the definition of how they proceed is often global in itself, right? What forms of solidarity can emerge out of the politics of successful social movements. So the book that I'm in the process of working on, it's a memoir I'm editing that originally came out and was published mainly only in Pakistan. It's about 800 pages long. I'm cutting it down to 300 pages, so it's an archival project. It's I don't even know if that's a literary project or what, but I'm editing it and creating an archive around this figure, Dada Amir Haider Khan, who is a very important figure in the Pakistani left, right? And so a little bit of his story. And some of it has come up in, two historians, two of the main texts that have looked at his sort of life as very formative. Vivek Bald's Bengali Harlem has one substantive chapter, but really there's a through line through the whole book that really draws on the memoir to get a sense of the things that were happening with South Asian sailors in the early period of the 20th century. And then Sally Howell, who unfortunately isn't here, but she'll be here later. Her book also makes use of Dada Khan's life when he was in Detroit, and I'll get into some of those details. But Dada Khan is basically, and he's also called Dada. That's a term that means grandfather. So it's a term that's often given in the South Asian left to those who are kind of like the elders. They're the forefathers. They're the folks that are sort of the leaders, or as it were. So Dada Khan was born around 1899, 1900, right? And he died till he lived till 1989. So he lived till about 90, right? So when he was 17 years old, right, he left his village, what was outside of Rawalpindi, which is very close to, it's sort of the sister city of Islamabad, right? He left that place and he went to Bombay and then got on a steamer ship, right? And so this ship is supposedly the SS Leviathan, which took him He traveled basically to the Cape of Africa. He eventually made his way to London and then New Orleans and then New York. New York, he jumped ship, right? And what that means is that he just decided to come to New York and hang out. His ship left him, right? And he, in that period, right? Again, so this is the 20s and the 30s. So he's going basically from New York to Detroit, traveling throughout the Midwest, and that's the part that Sally Howell picks up, right? And when he's in Detroit, he's interacting with Garveyites, he meets Agnes Smedley, he's interacting with folks who are in the Communist Party of the United States. He gets really enamored with Marxism. He starts organizing in Mosque. That's the part that Sally picks up in, which is very interesting too, right? He's going to Mosque and organizing and finding workers in these steel mills who he's bringing into sort of the approach of the Communist Party. Now from Detroit, he goes to New York. New York, he's again mixing with all sorts of folks, and this is where he then has a connection to the Ghadar Party. The Ghadar Party is a decolonial anti-imperial movement that was mostly based in San Francisco and Vancouver. Now, the narrative of the Ghadar Party, which people like Seema Sohi, who's written this beautiful book, Echoes of Mutiny, which chronicles a lot of the anti-imperial decolonizing work that happened in this period through the Ghadar Party. He's often compared to Bhagat Singh. Bhagat Singh was a major figure in the Ghadar Party. And Dada Khan, not only was he pamphleteering for the Ghadar Party, he was writing some texts, he was involved, he was connected to other folks. But the Ghadar Party is often seen as something that is mainly Sikh and Hindu, right? And that's also part of this alternative narrative here, right? After he leaves New York in the 30s, he's actually dispatched by the party in New York to go to the Soviet Union, where he gets trained at what's called the University of the East. He's trained basically to become an organizer, a militant organizer, right? And in this time, he's meeting basically the who's who of the communist left that end up in India, lots of people from the Arab world. And this is also part of this kind of recuperative or recovery project here, is that when we think about the left in the Muslim world, right, we don't actually have a lot of these histories because so much of those narratives have been either destroyed or they have been completely squashed and sort of written out. Really quickly, it's not a very good picture, but he was very centrally involved in the formation of the Communist Party in South India, which, for those of you who know your history in India or even follow politics in India, Kerala is one of the few democratically elected communist parties in the world, right? And it's an actually existing party. If you look at the development rates there, it's actually this super anomaly, right? Literacy rates in the 90s, women in the workforce also much more at a disparity than the rest of India. Poverty rates very different. So there's something interesting to think about there. And then the last two pictures that I'll show before I have to wrap up here. This one, Dada Khan, after he leaves, right, the Soviet Union, he goes to what's then still India. He's still working for the Ghadar Party. He's organizing. He's doing the stuff in South India. After partition, he relocates back to his ancestral homeland. He ends up in Pakistan and becomes a central figure of the Pakistani left, right? And he basically, before he arrived in Pakistan in the 50s, was part of a number of circles that were suspected of wanting to commit a coup of the then military dictator, right? So then he was put in prison for 10 years, and that's where he wrote his memoirs, right? So the very first volume of the memoirs and the second volume are basically handwritten at that period. So part of here, again, just to kind of give us a sense of where this trajectory is going, right? From Malcolm X to Dada Khan to a number of figures, certainly the kind of work that Donna's working with BLM or even Sylvia, in terms of Betty Shabazz and a number of figures that we would say are doing this kind of work that is, again, whether we call it left or not is not that important to me, but in a way it is that narrative of how are you doing work that is decolonizing, or even in the words of W.D. Muhammad, he called them creating liberation spaces. Right? What are these spaces of liberation that are being created such that alternative possibilities are created? So that's part of what I'm tracking here. All right, thanks.